For video 2, we're going to look at a muscle structure. So we want to learn what the muscle is made out of, and we're going to be focusing on skeletal muscles. And skeletal muscles are built a certain way. Let's go to our PowerPoint slide. And if you look at our PowerPoint slide here, this seventh slide kind of gives us a general vocabulary lesson on the different structures that make up muscle. Now, first of all, we need to understand that there's a couple of prefixes that are going to indicate that we're discussing a muscle. The first one is the prefix sarco. Sarco means muscle. So does myo. So when you're talking about sarcolemma, sarcomere, myofilaments, these are all muscle terms. So whenever you see the prefix sarco or myo, it's going to equal muscle. So look at this slide right here where it says muscle cells are called fibers. Muscle cells are not actually called cells because they are fused cells that develop when we're an embryo. So when we are an embryo, we make a bunch of muscle cells. These muscle cells then fuse together to make muscle fibers. Now, this is why in the last video I told you that skeletal muscle is multinucleated, because those embryonic muscle cells each have a nucleus, and when they fuse together, all those nuclei go into one fiber. So we call a muscle cell, a mature muscle cell, we actually call it a muscle fiber. What's really cool about this is it says the numbers remain constant. You're born with the same amount of muscle cells that you have throughout your whole life. Unfortunately, we can lose some, but you never add muscle fibers to your muscles. When you work out, and if you build muscle, you're just adding proteins to the muscle fibers you already have. You don't make new or more muscle fibers. Now, because of this weirdo thing with the muscle fiber not really being a cell, the cell components of a muscle all are a little bit unique. So, for example, the cytoplasm is called sarcoplasm. The cell membrane is called the sarcolemma. The contractile unit of a muscle fiber, that part of the cell that actually contracts, is called a sarcomere. And then we have smooth endoplasmic reticulum that has a very specific job in muscle. So it's not really smooth ER, so we call it sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, it's also important to think about all the connective tissue that's found throughout the muscle. So the muscle cells, the muscle fibers, are going to be all the contractile part of the muscle, but the muscle is infused with connective tissue to bind and hold that muscle together so that it's very durable and strong. And it shouldn't come to a surprise to you that muscles have lots of nerves going to them and lots of blood vessels, because we have to get a signal for the muscles to contract. That's what the nerves are doing. And then the blood is supplying all of the oxygen and glucose to the muscle cells so they can make lots of energy, ATPs, to contract and run their contraction cycle. So these are just some of the vocabulary. Now, is when we get into kind of the structure of a muscle. So muscles are made out of myofibrils. Remember, myo means muscle. So these are fibers of muscle that actually make up the cell. So it says they're thread-like structures extending from one end of the muscle fiber to the other. They're made out of proteins called myofilaments. And these myofilaments, we have two of them. One of them is called actin. The second one is called myosin. So the cell fiber is made out of myofibrils that are made out of these proteins called myofilaments. These proteins are actin and myosin. So let's go to a handout. We'll go to handout 10B, and here it is, handout 10B with my picture, and we're going to go over the muscle structure. So first of all, let's look at this picture here. Now with this picture, the picture is showing us the muscle structure broken down, all right? And so we're going to kind of pull out muscle and get to these myofibrils that I just mentioned. So when you look at this, kind of ignore all the other stuff, but this is an entire muscle. All right, see, it's attached to a bone. This entire muscle is made out of a bunch of bundles. And these bundles that are pulled out here, see there's 3 that are pulled out. These bundles are called fascicles or fasciculi, that's plural. So we pull out a fascicle, and these fascicles are going to be made out of bundles of these structures called myofibrils. All right? So the myofibrils are part of the cell. This fascicle is made out of a bunch of nerve cells, not fibrils, but cells. I misspoke. These muscle cells, we call them muscle fibers. So this is the whole muscle. This is a bundle of cells called a fascicle, and then we pull a muscle cell or muscle fiber, and each fascicle is made out of 10 to 100 muscle fibers. Now, the muscle fibers, the cells themselves, are made out of their own bundles of myofibrils. So this is the myofibril right here. And these myofibrils are made out of protein called myofilaments. And that's what the actin and the myosin is. What happens is the actin and myosin are bundled together in these myofibrils in bands. And this is what gives the skeletal muscle their striations. All right? So over here on the side, I'll kind of zoom out here, I have written that muscle fibers are filled with threads called myofibrils. All right? So our muscle fibers are built of these bundles of threads called myofibrils. In between the myofibrils is a bunch of smooth endoplasmic reticulum we call sarcoplasmic reticulum. And it's this webbing here. Now, sarcoplasmic reticulum, we're going to learn this a little bit later, but this is kind of a preview. It has a specific job. It says the sarcoplasmic reticulum encircles the myofibrils. It's similar to smooth ER, except it doesn't make fats like smooth ER does. All it does is hold calcium. And these calcium ions are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Remember back in chapter 6, I told you that calcium has 3 jobs. The first job and the most important job calcium has is muscle contraction. So this sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to be holding calcium so that it can cause the muscles to contract. And we'll actually get into how that exactly occurs a little bit later in this chapter. Now, another thing that you need to know, remember I just told you that the muscles are full of connective tissue. So there are connective tissues that infuse in the muscle. We have 3 different layers of connective tissue. It says we have the epimysium, paramysium, and endomysium. Remember, myo means muscle. So this is connective tissue within the muscle. The epimysium is connective tissue that's surrounding the entire muscle. So we have a band of connective tissue surrounding the entire muscle called epimysium. Paramysium wraps around these fascicle bundles. So each paramysium is wrapping around these fascicles. And then the final connective tissue is called endomysium, and it's wrapped around each individual cell. So you have 3 layers of connective tissue. Epimysium wrapping around the entire muscle, paramysium wrapping around fascicles, and then endomysium wrapping around individual muscle fibers. Right? So this gives the muscle a lot of strength and durability. It allows that muscle to really take on a lot of stress. And without the connective tissue, the muscle would be a lot weaker. Connective tissue is also what makes your steak tough. So if when you're eating a steak, the reason why it's tough and really chewy is because it has all this connective tissue. A lot of the processing of meat, like a marinade, for example, not only adds flavor, but marinade contains enzymes that'll break down this connective tissue and make that meat a lot more tender. And since, the meat we eat is just like the muscle that we're talking about, it has all this connective tissue in it. And so we have to tenderize it in order to enjoy our steak a little bit better. Okay, so that takes care of handout 2B. Now, 2B, 10B. And I'm going to come back to it, and we'll look at it again as we keep going through this structure of muscles. So stay tuned. Handout 10C is very similar to this, but we go into a little more structural detail. So stay tuned, and we'll continue this in the next video.